Okay. Hello. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning to hear a panel about following the money behind the backlash against climate change. Yeah, a happy subject for a Saturday morning, but good to see all of you. I wanted to start just with a couple of housekeeping things. Hello, my name is Peter Gagan. I am the Editor-in-Chief of OpenDemocracy. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Felicity Lawrence from The Guardian, Rich Collett-White, who's the Deputy Editor of DSMOG, and I want to send my apologies for my colleague Martin Williams, who unfortunately maybe didn't wear a mask quite enough and has come down with COVID, so he's unable to be here, so sorry about that. I've got a note in front of me that says no questions from the audience. I must confess I like questions from audiences. It's nice to hear what you think too. So what I was going to suggest, if possible, if you wanted to, my DMs on Twitter are open, and if you have any questions during the session, please DM me. My Twitter handle is quite long and confusing. It's my name, if you have the program, Peter Gagan, and it's Peter K. Gagan on Twitter, so PeterKGeoghegan. Even I struggle sometimes to remember how to spell my own name. But anyway, without further ado, let's move on to the subject at hand. And I have to say, if you told me maybe a year ago that I would be sitting in front of a panel at Perugia talking about climate change, I would have been kind of surprised, actually. I'd spent the last few years writing a lot about dark money and political influence in the UK, especially with regards to the Brexit referendum, but more generally in British politics, the power of lobbying and vested interest in British politics. But over the last few months, I've become increasingly interested in what seems to be an emerging front in the UK, and also another bit of housekeeping. To warn you, this panel is very UK-focused. We might talk a bit about America, but it'll mainly be the UK. I'd love to hear contributions from some people here from Europe and elsewhere about what's happening in your countries too, but our panel is fairly UK-focused. I'm going to apologise. But I became increasingly interested in what was happening in the UK around climate change and the discourse around climate change, because I could see that a lot of the characters who I'd been writing about for years when it came to pumping money into political referendums in the UK had started kind of emerging and becoming very interested in the net zero strategy. So the United Kingdom is a strategy that will have an net zero target for 2050. And I became particularly interested maybe in November of 2021, just before the COP conference. You might remember the COP26 conference in Glasgow. And I was reading, as I sometimes do, the pages of the Daily Telegraph, which is a very well-known centre-right newspaper in the United Kingdom. There was a curious news story. It said that a majority of people in the United Kingdom wanted to have a referendum on net zero. So a majority of people wanted to vote on Britain's net zero policies. This is a curious thing, I thought, because I'd never heard of this idea that people really cared that much about the net zero policies. But also, as you might be aware, Britain is not Switzerland. We don't really have referendums very often. The Brexit referendum was the first referendum since 1975. So I became quite interested in this. I started looking at this story, and I noticed that this group were called Car26, and they'd paid a professional pollster. They'd paid money to ask a polling question that I'd never really heard anybody ask before. So I kind of went, who are these people? So I went, as you do as a journalist, I looked up on Companies House, our register of companies in the United Kingdom. I found out this group had only been created a month beforehand. I noticed that the front person for this, an attractive young woman, was also a representative of a pretty far-right, a very right-of-centre political party in the United Kingdom called Reclaim, which was bankrolled by a man that I subsequently reported on as having huge interest in oil and gas. I thought that's quite interesting too. And I looked at their website, and on their website they talked about how young people being involved in climate change was akin to child abuse. Well, they called it borderline child abuse. And I scrolled through all this, and I got to the end of the website, and it said, this website is powered by a company called Blue Sky. And I thought, that's interesting. I've heard of Blue Sky. They're a small PR firm run by lots of people who've been involved in the Brexit referendum. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because within about 48 hours, this same story was appearing in lots of other media. There was phone-in shows on radio about whether we should have a referendum on net zero. In the months since that story, Nigel Farage has announced that he's going to have he's set up his own political movement dedicated to a referendum on net zero. There's been lots and lots of column inches about the need for a referendum on net zero. British politicians in the Conservative Party, right-wing British Conservative politicians, have set up their own net zero scrutiny group. A well-known climate change denial, or skeptic at least, organisation called the Foundation for Global Warming, which is based in a kind of shadowy group based in the United Kingdom in London. They've rebranded as Net Zero Watch. So in a few months, we've seen lots and lots of kind of this huge swell of a conversation around net zero in the UK. And what's really interesting is a lot of the people who are involved in this conversation are the kind of people, the same people who were involved in the Brexit referendum, who've been involved in lots of clandestine political campaigns in the United Kingdom. And often they are people who work for groups who do not declare where their money comes from, what we call dark money. And what dark money means is anonymous political funding that gets into the political system. That's money that's unaccountable, money that goes into parties without being, having to be registered, money that goes into think tanks and media and influence campaigns. And so what we've seen in the last few months is a real ratcheting up of this. And I've been really interested that the work I was doing over the last few years looking at party politics writ large has now become really, really focused on climate and climate change action and the opposition to climate change action. And really what we're hopefully going to do in this panel today is talk through a bit about how this is happening, how this playbook, this kind of dark money playbook works in practice, and some of the things that we're starting to see in the United Kingdom, maybe they're kind of resonating where you are, but also we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms and the ways in which as journalists we've tried to cover this story, because by its very nature, dark money is hard to trace. If it was easy to trace, it wouldn't be called dark. And partly what myself and my colleagues at openDemocracy, but also other people on this panel with me today, what we are trying to do, a lot of us, is to try and chart what's happening and how this influence campaign is trying to shape our politics. And given that the climate emergency is going to be the political issue of our generation and the generations to come, unfortunately, we're probably going to see a hell of a lot more of this, and I think it's really important as journalists that we're aware of how this operates and what it looks like. And so I'm going to open this up by asking Felicity to kind of speak to some of this and the work that she's been doing on this, what we call the playbook.
Hello, thank you very much, Peter. So yes, the playbook is something that I've been following for perhaps 20 years, not originally in relation to climate change, but originally in relation to health. And what's fascinating is how well worn and practiced the playbook is and what the elements of it are and the extent to which it was sort of invented by a mixture of powerful dark money in the States, very much associated with fossil fuels and the tobacco industry, and a whole product, what's called a product defense industry, which goes back to the 1950s, 1960s, and tobacco, and it's sort of made up of public affairs people, lobby groups, lawyers who act as lobbyists, and there's a whole machinery of it, and I think it's actually really worth understanding the different elements of it because it keeps popping up. I first, as I say, came across it with tobacco. It's the playbook that was used by the food industry, is still used by the food industry to stop action on obesity and health, and probably most damaging of all with climate change. This kind of delay and denial movement goes through various phases. And like Peter, I noticed this extraordinary overlap with hardcore Brexiteers. So in the UK referendum, it was very finely balanced, and when people were campaigning, there was no suggestion that we would leave the European Customs Union or that we would have that kind of really savage break with our European partners. And yet by the end of the political season of Brexit, this kind of playbook had managed to move us from something that we thought was just impossible and would never be contemplated to shifting us far to the right in terms of Europe, and it became inevitable. The unthinkable became inevitable. We had this very hard break from the European Union. The playbook starts typically, and tobacco is the model, and climate change, you'll all be familiar with some of this. It starts with questioning the science. And it's interesting to think about how they do that. it sort of exploits and weaponizes and subverts the very principles of scientific inquiry. So if you're a genuine scientist, you start with a hypothesis, you test it, you have different theories, different explanations for what you're seeing, and you deliberately explore uncertainty to check your hypothesis. And eventually you come to, with the weight of evidence, you move towards certain conclusions to explain what you're seeing, and a consensus emerges. But certainty is usually a very long way off, and proof is even further off. So the point at which you reach consensus can be sort of 20 years before you actually get proof, and that was certainly true with tobacco. Everybody knew it caused disease a good 20 years before proof could actually prove it scientifically. And the same has happened with climate, that the denial movement has exploited that very nature of honest science inquiry, and it amplifies the uncertainty even when people have actually got to a point where they're reaching consensus and they're pretty sure. And it cherry picks data and then reinterprets results to come up with different answers. It attacks scientists, and it pays scientists to come up with alternative science, which ironically they usually call sound science in there. Is a key phrase is the sound science. There's lots of doublespeak in this movement. The other thing that's crucial to the playbook for denial and delay on big issues are the way the industry establishes channels of influence. And one of the key channels is so-called scholarly institutes or think tanks. And there are dozens of them all around the world, and in theory they have fellows who produce semi-academic independent policy papers and research. They use the language of academia, but very often the fellows have come from the media, politics, the law. They're not actually likely to have come from academia very often. And they publish the work, and one of the key elements is that the think tank sort of can deny institutional responsibility. So whenever you challenge them about a piece of work, they say, well, that's the view of that particular fellow. It doesn't represent our view. And so there's a slipperiness there. And the think tanks that have promoted most of the skepticism, they hate the word denial and always come back at us if we accuse them of denial. So let's pretend it's skepticism. But the ones who are most vocal on skepticism about climate and the need for action are the ones who are always most opaque about their funding. There are lots of think tanks on the left who would promote action on climate or action on health. And the difference for me is that they almost always, in fact, I can't think of an exception, they declare where their money's coming from. You can see if there are any conflicts of interest. The ones who are on the right, climate denial, sort of skepticism, and refuse to tell you who their funders are. And one of the key playbook tricks is to proliferate think tanks. So you'd think there'd be enough to have 3 or 4 working in the territory, but there might be 50. And they keep reinventing them and having new ones. And with Brexit, we had a kind of great flurry of new think tanks. It was almost impossible to keep up with them. But actually, they were all the same people or overlapping people with overlapping funders. But what that does is create a sort of river of commentary, which gives this impression of a huge weight of opinion by this very extreme, behind this very extreme view. And that's a key part of sort of shifting what we call the Overton window, the area in which something is politically unthinkable and you shift it until it becomes not only thinkable but inevitable. And we saw that very, very clearly with Brexit. And then in parallel to that, there are the fake grassroots movements. So you've got the scholarly institutes, and the people who invented this whole methodology talked about breeding think tanks and influencing universities and media through them. And in parallel to that, they create these supposed grassroots movements, which are, we call astroturf because it's fake grassroots. And you see that, most famously, it was with the Tea Party, whose original operations were funded by organizations linked to the big fossil fuel billionaires, the Koch brothers. You see it with tobacco, where there was a whole populist kind of grassroots movement called Forest, which was freedom and the right to enjoy smoking tobacco, which supposedly represented the common man, but actually was an industry operation. And we're now seeing it with the net zero scrutiny and fair fuel campaigns. Don't harm the common man with these awful green taxes. The next strand is to buy politicians, to influence committees in Parliament, to lobby the regulator, to get your people on advisory boards. And we've looked a lot in The Guardian at how all these characters overlap and how, particularly with Brexit and with climate change, they've managed to get themselves onto key boards advising ministers, or they have produced lots of little groups for parliamentarians so that they feed policy papers into them and their ideas into them. And that's a particular feature of the Johnson British government. His cabinet, when he won the election, had 14 members who had been part of an Institute of Economic Affairs program, and the IEA boasted about it, which is one of the right-wing think tanks that has in the past published a huge amount of climate skepticism and is small state, no need for collective action or state action on anything. So that's the sort of, I recognize that pattern in most of the areas that I've covered. So it's not just climate, it's definitely health, the food industry, the biotech industry, the chemicals industry, tobacco. And it's sort of amazing that given how established the playbook is, that the media still doesn't pick it up. It still falls for it. So when we had 4 or 5 supposedly new think tanks with all the same people, producing papers during the Brexit negotiations, they were on the front page of all the newspapers every day. They managed to capture the headlines and the narrative day after day after day, and that put enormous pressure on Theresa May and shifted the whole debate to a place that actually nobody had voted for. We certainly hadn't been told in the referendum that that's what we were voting for. And that's what you can see with this net zero. It's exactly the same thing. You've got the sort of network of think tanks, scholarly institutes, you've got fake grassroots movements, and above all, you've got a collusive right-wing press in the UK, which is happy to take these lines day after day and make front-page stories out of them. I think what we're seeing with climate and net zero is the phase that the tobacco industry reached sort of late 70s, where it became impossible to deny that smoking was killing people. So they actually gave up denying it, but they had actually genuinely subverted the science, commissioned fake, bogus science, suborned people to come up with their view of the world. But it got to the point where you couldn't any longer deny disease. So then their tactic switches to delay government action and divert, preserve corporate profits at all costs, and accept and sound reasonable, but you're going to have a different strategy. And that's where we are with climate change. I think what we're hearing, the arguments we're hearing are the ones that you heard from tobacco. Free market solutions are best. There'll be technical solutions to this. There's lots of language around freedom, and you should be free to do harm to yourself if you want. It's not for the state to interfere. And above all, don't upset the children. It's really, really irresponsible of us to tell the truth as it is, because it's shocking and it's too apocalyptic and it's damaging our poor children's mental health. Oh, and by the way, it's all about personal responsibility anyway. It's never about the state taking action. It's up to us as individuals. The net zero, we've moved on slightly from needing the right-wing press. They are still very much part of this playbook and play a very vital role, but of course social media has made them slightly less vital to the operation, so a lot of it has moved to social media. And the overlap with these different groups, hard Brexit, anti-climate action, and I think, why is this? What's the underlying sort of thinking? And I think it's quite important to realise that different elements of it have actually different motivations, but they do overlap, because otherwise, if you're not careful, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. And when we find all these connections between people and their financial interests in fossil fuels and things that require them to block action on climate change, they tend to respond by saying, yeah, so we share an outlook of the world. You know, we're small state, low tax politicians, and they quite often mock us because we draw these little diagrams, and they call them spidergrams, linking everybody to everybody, and you know, you can get in 10 moves from one person to the whole of the world. And they would say, you know, look here, Peter and I share an outlook, and Rich and I share an outlook, and you know, our phones are near each other. We're definitely in a network, and so they try and mock it as absurd. But it is very genuine, and it can be very subtle. Sometimes it can be very blatant, but it can be very subtle. And I think the motivations are, for some of the politicians, they're genuinely just radical right ideologues who are ferociously anti-state, want a very small state, are anti-tax and anti-regulation. And some of the Tory MPs who are behind the net zero scrutiny group fall into that category. Although it should also be said that they've been off to the States a lot to some of these think tank jamborees, where they get schooled in how to be effective and how to communicate on WhatsApp and how to run groups. So let's not call it grooming, but it's interesting that they have that background. So there are those ideologue politicians who come at it from one angle. There are the big corporates who are, you know, produce stuff that we all use and depend on, like oil or sugar or alcohol or whatever, but for whom, you know, their products have a dangerous aspect. They're environmentally damaging, they're damaging to health, and so it's appropriate that they're regulated. But in terms of their corporate profits, they are determined to avoid or stymie regulation as far as possible. And then there are the billionaires who've made their money, usually from those sorts of industries, who want to hang on to it and certainly don't want it taxed, and see any action on climate as a direct threat to their wealth. And I think you cannot, one of the things when I was looking at this for The Guardian and writing about Brexit and these overlaps, I was really struck that I hadn't previously understood just how viscerally they hate the European Union. And that was quite shocking to me. But they see the European Union, they're in this privileged position, either as billionaires or transnational corporates, where they are so powerful, their power is much bigger than the power of an individual nation state. And it's very hard for individual governments to rein them in, because they'll sort of lose out to another government that's not regulating in that way. And they see the EU as this supranational body that actually is powerful enough to stand up to them. And the EU is taking action on climate change. It follows the precautionary principle when it's regulating things, so it doesn't wait for proof of harm that's too slow coming. It thinks, if this might harm, we should regulate about it. It's acting on privacy and data flows, which of course is anathema to the big tech companies in the States. And so the EU is a real threat to them, and they hate it. And that's driving so much of this radical break with it. It's sort of as though there's no room for sense about what was in Britain's best interest in terms of how we negotiated an exit from the European Union that might be a compromise. And of course, above all, climate action requires collective action. There tend to be individualist, I've got my money, I don't want the state to take it, and I don't need the state. And the whole point of climate change and climate breakdown is that the only way we can tackle it is by collective action and collective sacrifice for greater benefits. And that will be, they talk about it as a cult, a religion that young people have been sucked into, and for them, therefore, it's very threatening, because it is powerful and people know what needs to be done, and they are joining the movements to take action. So how do we research all that at The Guardian? It's very, it's deliberately very opaque. It is dark money, and they don't like to tell you much. So for some of the work to track who was funding whom, we did a lot of scraping of what are called 990 forms in the States. The people giving money to these sorts of organizations are very anti-tax. And if you want to give money to a non-profit in the States, you can get a tax credit, but only if you make a declaration on these 990 forms. So that's one of their Achilles heels. They're so loath to pay tax. They do actually admit on these forms what donations they've made. And we tracked a lot of that and had help from our data team to scrape sort of great reams and reams of filings for the biggest foundations and the big fossil fuel magnates about where they were sending their money. A lot of that work was done originally by an organization called ProPublica, who've been talking here, and it's now being taken over by something called GuideStar, and if you want to track those things, that's the best place to go. But because people were writing about that, they've gradually started hiding further, and so they now have created these umbrella organizations to make donations, like the Donors Trust, and so it's become even harder. You actually can't really see. We did track about $4 million of donations from US organizations to think tanks here that were promoting a hard Brexit. And it should be said that's not very much money in American terms, but British politics is bought very, very cheap. It's astonishing how little money you need to buy a British politician or British politics. We did lots of FOIs about government ministerial meetings with industry, committee meetings, how advisory boards were appointed, found lots of overlaps between all these groups, but we're having real difficulty with FOI in the UK because the UK government is really trying to break it. I mean, they are breaking all the rules on deadlines for FOI. They're refusing stuff, so you have to go right to the end of the line, and that can take 9 months. So they're doing that very deliberately to stop you publishing anything that's timely, and as a group of media organizations who are trying to fight back on that. So actually, with all those blocks on the road to finding out who's really doing what and being paid by whom and being influenced by whom, you fall back mostly on good old-fashioned shoe leather and really sort of just very untechy searching. I've always found that people in these think tanks, those sorts of politicians, talk very openly amongst themselves when they think they're talking to themselves, but they do also now record a lot of that. So if you sort of spend hours rootling around and you find obscure videos of obscure conferences in obscure parts of the United States, you'll catch some British politician saying the EU needs to be wholly torn down and taking money from the fossil fuel companies. So I did a lot. We've done a lot of that sort of stuff. And there's nothing that beats human intelligence. I mean, I know there are wonders with tech and data scraping, but actually, when people are trying to hide things, an awful lot of our information has just come from the good old-fashioned journalist technique of cultivating contacts, making sure they know they'll be protected, particularly if they're civil servants, over a very long period, and asking questions and going back and back again.
Thank you very much, Felicity. You've really done a great job there of summarising a lot of the big issues that are in this space. Thank you. And I thought what you were talking about, the think tank world is a really fascinating one. It's one that I've written about at openDemocracy, and we've written about a lot for many years. And this kind of world of connected groups that just pop up with really similar people, almost, do you think if you ran an organisation with you and your colleagues, you might keep that one organisation. Running one organisation, as I can tell you, is enough work. But actually, they seem to enjoy creating lots of other organisations with the exact same people. One would wonder if there is a coordination that goes around that, and obviously there is, because it allows you to present yourself as a new group and get new publicity. And one of the ways I find really helpful to keep track of all these groups actually is DSMOG's fantastic resource. They've done a great job of mapping and of creating, they might call them spidergrams, but creating really excellent maps of how this hydra works and is interlinked to each other. And I guess, Rich, I kind of wanted just to ask you a bit more about like almost the context of where we are right now in the UK, and I know in Europe too, we have this kind of cost of living crisis, which is saying, look, we can't do things about climate because we need to focus on ordinary people, as you say, Felicity. But also as well, the new IPCC report seems to kind of recognise that the role of lobbying and the role of oil and gas lobbying and other types of lobbying around stopping action. So, Joe, could you just paint a picture of where we are and what that might mean for some of the world that Felicity has outlined so well?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to. Yeah, thanks so much for coming, everyone. It's great to see so much interest in this issue. I think it can sometimes feel like a bit of a niche subject that not many people are particularly engaged with. But I think that's shifting as we're kind of seeing this backlash grow. So maybe just to say a couple of words about DeSmog, if in case you haven't come across us. We've been going for about 16 years, originally started in the US, particularly with a focus on the fossil fuel industry and mapping this kind of sprawling network of think tanks and PR campaigns, AstroTurf groups. And we've kind of, grown our operation, and we launched a kind of global outlet last year to really kind of connect the dots between all of these different groups operating in different countries, and really sort of, branch out beyond just the fossil fuel industry, because this kind of thing is happening, across all sort of high carbon sectors, the automotive industry, agriculture, and you kind of see the same tactics being used across the board, often, being promoted by the same groups. And so, that's just to kind of say this is nothing new necessarily. I think Peter mentioned earlier in the UK, a particularly prominent group called the Global Warming Policy Foundation. They started during the Copenhagen climate conference back in 2009, and then there was a big coalition called the Global Climate Coalition. So all of this stuff kind of stretches back quite a long way. But I think it's fair to say it sort of went a little bit quiet, I think, for a few years. We were still kind of doing investigations, but I think they were struggling to break through maybe to the mainstream and really get coverage for some of the things they were trying to argue. I think that's changed really in the last year or two. Particularly in the last sort of half year, with the kind of the energy price crisis that's been going on as we've come out of lockdowns. Demand has kind of shot up, and with it, oil and gas prices, and so I think a lot of these groups have sensed the political opportunity there. They feel that this is a reason why we need to strip away all of the kind of green policies, and we need to really produce a lot more oil and gas kind of domestically. And then obviously with the invasion of Ukraine in the last month or two, that's given another opportunity for lots of these groups to really kind of reassert themselves and secure front page coverage of their kind of recommendations. And so I think, it's an interesting time that we're living in right now. We've for a lot of our work, we've just been sort of focusing on a lot of these kind of outright denial groups, but that's very much shifted to a sort of delay tactic. They're kind of pushing not necessarily completely false solutions to climate change, but kind of quite limited ones. They're kind of exaggerating the potential of tech solutions like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, nuclear, all of which can have a role to play. There's obviously that's an important thing to say here. There's a difference between legitimate debate around climate policy and what is the best approach to tackling climate change, and then the kind of very misleading kind of talking points that they'll kind of promote. And I think it's easy to kind of dismiss some of this stuff as quite fringe, because maybe you don't come across it in some of the outlets that you read. Maybe you might not see it covered a huge amount in The Guardian or maybe other outlets. But if you read quite populist kind of right-wing tabloids, you'll come across this stuff all the time, and just talking.
Great vote of confidence in the future of the UK. And they had huge big billboards all over Glasgow, a city I lived in for many years, talking about hydrogen. And I think hydrogen's a really good and interesting example of this. You know, like, hydrogen is part of this conversation. It should be, green hydrogen should be, but actually what they're talking about is blue hydrogen. They're talking about hydrogen that is produced from the gas industry. And I think that's really interesting. I think these are technical issues. And I think what you see with these sort of groups is the flattening of that, what Felicity talks about, sound science, this kind of flattening, and this idea of you know, technical solutions as well to these problems. If we believe in the power of innovation, the power of the market to solve these, and it was really striking when I started researching into these groups in the last few months, because I covered the Brexit referendum and the kind of the money behind that subsequently so much. And what we saw around the Northern Irish border, for example, which clearly emerged as this huge issue, not just in the UK, but became like an international issue, was the idea there'd be technological solutions. And I remember writing about these groups, which basically what had happened was a private company had set up, funded by a Brexit donor who used to be a donor to the Liberal Democrats in the UK, and he stopped donating to Liberal Democrats because they didn't make him a Sir. So he actually pulled his money, which tells you a lot about British politics. And he set up a company which was called it was called Prosperity UK, but it was investigating technological solutions to the Irish border. And what was really interesting about that was this. What you saw was the idea that we could, you know, technology could solve this, and we saw politicians from various political parties, but mainly the right to the Conservative Party, lining up to say there's going to be technological solutions to this, getting huge amounts of publicity, and also private companies were getting very involved in this too, because companies provide border controls in this instance, or companies provide blue hydrogen in the case of INEOS, and they have a huge vested interest in this. And what you see is this confluence of interests. And I think it's something that we're going to see more and more of, because you can see, it's not hard to see where there's going to be huge financial incentives as well. You know, we at openDemocracy reporting a lot about the lobbying that goes around with the oil and gas industry, and the increasing growth of lobbying around the oil and gas industry, and the very specific issues. I think Michael Mann, the title of his talk at Perugia this year, kind of really hammered it home, was from denial to delay, and what Bill McKibben calls predatory delay. We're seeing this huge focus really on not acting, on shifting away from, as we saw with tobacco, actually, okay, we accept that climate change is real, but now isn't the time to do anything about it. We can't afford to do anything about it. And we can see those mechanisms, you know, taking shape really, really clearly. And it's grimly fascinating to watch. You know, we've tracked political donations, particularly to the Conservative Party in the UK from the oil and gas industry, and there's huge confluence of interests, both directly from oil and gas companies, but also we've seen an emergence in Britain. Our politics runs on private money, a huge focus on a lot of money. Private money comes now to political parties from the private equity sector and the hedge fund sector, all of whom often have very, very large interests in oil and gas. So, you know, the profits of the North Sea, the profits of BP and Shell this year as oil prices go up vertiginously, there's huge interest there in not changing this. And we know from how politics works, at least in the United Kingdom, that there's influence that can be bought, because if you're a political donor in the United Kingdom and if you give £50,000 a year, you can become a member of a thing called the Conservative Leaders Group, which means you get every quarter, once every 3 months, you can sit down and have dinner with the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers off record and chat about whatever you want. There's no notes kept and no meetings for £50,000. Which, as Felicity says, if you compare it to America, is very cheap for a huge amount of access. And we know decisions are influenced in this way. And if they're not, we can't tell because it's so opaque. And I think that's one of the real challenges as a journalist in covering these stories. You know, like Felicity says, I think, you know, whether it's scraping 990s from the US, looking at political filings in the United Kingdom and the US as well, looking at things like the US actually has got very good lobbying registers. The United Kingdom has absolutely appalling lobbying registers. They're actually worse than useless. But they do exist, which you can try and consult them. Looking at things like the register of MPs' interests in the United Kingdom, MEPs' registers of interest in Brussels, US registers of interest too. Talking to human sources as well, looking and talking, you know, we're quite lucky in some respects, to be based near London, which is one of the international centres for lobbying around this. Between London and New York is an international centre where you can go and you can pay someone, often someone who used to be a member of the British Parliament, an obscene amount of money to push and lobby for your interests. And that's a big part of this. The lobbying industry is a huge part of this. And unfortunately, it's not hard to imagine as the delaying tactics grow, the lobbying industry around this. Greenwashing, I think, is a growing part of this too. And the playbook is often around greenwashing. It's a huge, huge facet of it too. We've a few more points I wouldn't mind, I would like to open up, but we have actually got some questions coming in on my Twitter, so I think I might try and take some of these as we go. We've got one here from Alessio Perrone, who I'm very lucky to have known and worked with slightly before at openDemocracy as well. And he asked a very interesting question. He says, I'm interested in how much of the tactics and goals of these influence groups have been imported from the United States, where climate skeptics have been stronger for decades. And do you think individuals and lobbies from across the Atlantic have actively involved in pushing this in the UK? And you know, I might start, Rich, with you in the first part of that. I know it's an issue that you've written about and we've written about, but how much do you think of these tactics and these influence are coming from the United States? What are the kind of linkages between the groups you've been writing about and we've been writing about in the US?
Yeah, I mean, there's huge kind of crossover between US and UK groups. You know, they meet each other. They often kind of fund each other's projects. There's kind of UK groups who have set up kind of American friends of, you know, such and such a think tank to kind of raise donations in the US. There's lots of UK politicians who frequently go over to the US to kind of speak at conferences and you know, get training in some of these kind of tactics. I mean, I think there's also the kind of rhetoric that's been imported. You know, you kind of hear phrases like, you know, the kind of climate hoax and climate alarmism and climate catastrophism, that sort of thing, that I think really originated in the US. There's also the kind of Red Scare, I think, that happens around some of this. You know, there's this idea that, you know, all environmentalists are kind of secret socialists, secret communists, and that's why we need to kind of fight their regulations. And I think, yeah, there's a kind of a uniquely British flavour to it. You know, they don't just. I think they realise that they can't quite use exactly the same kind of rhetoric as you'd maybe get away with on the libertarian right. But yeah, there's a huge amount of crossover, definitely. Yeah.
And it's interesting just to pick up the other part of that question. Do you think individuals from across the Atlantic have been actively involved in pushing this in the UK? It's quite striking. You know, I've written about it. Felicity has too. One MP, Steve Baker, who was the driving force behind the European Research Group, which was kind of a wing of the Conservative Party that had existed for about 20 years. You know, just for an aside, actually, the European Research Group, in all of this stuff, almost, you might notice, everything is kind of the exact opposite of what it says it is. So it's kind of like a parallel universe. So the European Research Group is the most anti-Europe, Eurosceptic group in the history of British politics, but doing very, very limited research on Europe. Similarly, forest and tobacco. You know, there's a double think here when it comes to names. But so Steve Baker, who's behind the European Research Group, and then kind of morphed the European Research Group into what's called the Net Zero Scrutiny Group of MPs, who have become very influential, I think, in the backbench of the Conservative Party and take advantage of the quixotic nature of British politics, or the kind of unusual paradox of British politics, where backbench MPs at a certain time can be very important. And Steve Baker has been very close to the libertarian right in the United States for many years. He's been over to people like the Heritage Foundation, the Atlas Network. He's been on, you know, retreats to Central America with these kind of groups, with the Atlas Network, which effectively are talking about what are kind of libertarian boot camp, in which you are kind of schooled in the kind of libertarian perspective that's been very, very powerful on the right of American politics since the 1970s, and really emerged from a whole, I wrote quite a lot of it in my last book about this, about a lot of it came out of the groups funded by the Koch brothers, the oil and gas billionaires, and a very specific series of tactics. It's in some ways very clever. The idea was that you would seed It's kind of it's the long march to the institutions, but from the right. You know, the idea is that you would seed these ideas through think tanks that sounded like they were academic institutions. You would pay actual academics to do research. You would lobby politicians. You would pay politicians as well. And that's what we've started in the 70s, and I think there's a lot of echoes of that now in what we've seen at times in the United Kingdom. The discourse is different, I think. I think the constituency in terms of politics is smaller in the United Kingdom in terms of everyday voters. You know, if a political party existed in Britain with the kind of European Research Group policy platform, it would struggle to get 10% of the votes, probably. But they're very, very influential. We saw it too with COVID. There was a thing called the COVID Recovery Group. Again, COVID Recovery Group, which had the same huge membership crossover with the European Research Group and the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, and they were really very against COVID restrictions, talking a lot about freedom. All the restrictions that eventually were taken away in the United Kingdom, very much pushed by this group, because it was the biggest rebellion, I think, in recent political history outside of Brexit. About just over 100 MPs rebelled against the government over COVID restrictions. So you might think they must have been very politically savvy looking at polls, but if you look at polls in Britain, the vast majority of British voters were not in favour of what they were pushing. So there's a possibility in a parliamentary system like Britain's, a first-past-the-post system, which is very similar to the United States. I think there's a kind of crossover there as well, which is quite different to Europe. We're now getting a few more questions in, which is nice, so we will cover some of our other issues, but I'm going to try and take one or two more questions. Felicity, there's a question here from Tina. She says you mentioned being tired as child abusers and grooming and cultists for wanting to talk about climate change in schools. And she's saying that this kind of language is also appearing now in the United States around things like, you know, critical race theory, LGBTQI issues, and things like that. You know, is the right-wing smear of child abuse, you know, a new part of the playbook, and is it effective? Is it something that we're kind of seeing? You know, is it something that existed before? Is it a new thing, or is it just a kind of epiphenomenon?
I actually just don't know. Sorry, I don't know. So I don't think I should wade in. It's very interesting. I'll go and look. That's not something I've made a link with before.
No problem, Felicity. And there's one other question before we maybe continue on some of the other discussions. John Crowley is asking as well, how are these groups using the Ukraine crisis and the search for oil and gas away from Russia as an excuse to float re-exploration of the North Sea and putting fracking back on the table? I think it's fair to say even in the last 3 months we've seen a real change in some of the discourse around this. Rich, what do you say? Sorry, yeah, Felicity.
No, they're absolutely opportunist, and they will change their spots to just keep coming back. And that's one of the things that makes it so hard to track and really say, because the news cycle is such that it's you know, I was thinking with the Brexit stuff and how these groups who are actually all interconnected manage to capture headlines day after day after day. And by the time you've caught up with who they are, it's moved on to the next thing. And they're very opportunist, so they will come in and, yes, everything's different now with Ukraine. We must reopen these North Sea oil wells, and you know, which actually, you know, obviously isn't the answer. And renewables are now doing very well, and the answer probably is to go full steam ahead. But you know, the fracking thing I think is really puzzling, because it seems so improbable in the UK. There are particular issues with it here, and yet they've raised it, and you wonder if that's not just a sort of false flag for something else, to be honest. There are all sorts of tactics going on, and by the time we've caught up with them, they've usually moved on to something else.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to add, I mean, I think it's interesting how, you know, they're obviously very selective with the kind of information that they give on these kind of things. You know, there's obviously, you know, it's fine to make the case for more oil and gas. You know, people have a right to debate these issues, but it's when they kind of say, oh, it's gonna cut all of our energy bills. It's gonna, you know, allow us to, you know, free ourselves from Russian oil and gas just like that, when, you know, most of these projects won't actually get going for years and years. You know, the oil and gas industry isn't nationalised in the UK, so it will just sell all of its products on the open market. So it's not like it will suddenly, you know, do all the things that they claim it will. And, you know, they've had some success this week. We had a new energy strategy announced by the government, and they're going to kind of potentially reopen the door to fracking and kind of exploring whether there should be a ban on that, because there's a kind of temporary ban, a sort of moratorium on it at the moment. And yeah, I think there's just very misleading arguments really around the need for more domestic oil and gas when lots of other solutions could be ramped up very quickly. It's just, yeah, it's a kind of bizarre argument to, you know, while we're all kind of at the mercy of these very volatile gas prices, which are, you know, adding hundreds of pounds onto our energy bills, they're saying, oh, we need more gas, that's what we need, rather than, you know, insulating our buildings and, yeah, trying to get off gas. But yeah, there's been a lot of that in the last few months, definitely.
Yeah, it's very interesting to watch this sort of core little group suddenly becoming terribly interested in the poor and the cost of living crisis, which has to be said, they haven't been very interested in before. And they just use these issues as a wedge, really. It's actually in the UK Parliament, it's actually a tiny number of people who are really actively pursuing that, and as I say, it's quite, you know, you wouldn't have heard a lot from them in the past about people who couldn't afford their fuel. And there's an interesting dynamic in the UK because the Conservatives won a lot of traditional Labour seats in the last election over the whole Brexit issue in a very populist way. And so it suits them to take up that issue and claim that that's what's motivating them. But if it is, it's quite a new and unexpected motivation from a group who think the state should be very small, everybody, you know, personal responsibility is the mantra, and don't look to the state for help.
Yeah, I think we're kind of seeing a new discourse emerging around some of this in the UK and probably elsewhere too. Before we move, I think I might try and take one or two questions before it ends, but there's one other thing I wanted to kind of pick up on as well. Like, we talked a lot about the media here, you know, and how influencing the media is really important to kind of pushing these messages out, but it's also kind of striking on this panel. We've got, you know, I'm from openDemocracy, an independent media outlet in the UK, kind of funded by our readers and our subscribers and our donors. We've Rich here from Smog, The Guardian, who've done terrific work on this issue for a very long time too. But, you know, Britain has a great history of great investigative journalism. There's still great investigative journalism going on. It feels like some of these issues are issues that, you know, outside of some spaces like, you know, The Guardian, haven't really had so much attention from British journalism. And I kind of almost, yeah, why do we think, you know, why is it that it's smaller outlets like ours, or, you know, something like The Guardian, but otherwise it isn't an issue that seems to be kind of, it's left almost to the fringes of journalism to try and take it on. Like, why do we think that's happening? What's happening behind that?
I think there are two dynamics. One is that we have a very right-wing press in the UK with owners who've got particular interests, who do not want to see state action, and they dominate the media landscape and aren't really interrogated. And when something's changing its shape all the time, it's quite hard to keep up with. So they've got this very successful, very cheap way of generating day after day of headlines, which creates the impression of a groundswell of support, which is really quite fake. So I think that's part of the dynamic. I think the other thing is that although, you know, The Guardian has got a long track record of investing a huge amount of reporting resource into this, but it's quite hard to report some of it, partly because these are dark money networks, and you do end up with these spidergrams that, you know, if you're not careful, look as though you're conspiracy theorists. And I think, you know, there's a limit to how much you can put something like that straight into a mainstream newspaper. People say, oh, I've lost track, you know, that's because it's all done through intermediaries, and that's where this ecology of newer media outlets has been so important, because you've got the scope and the time to do the sort of really nitty-gritty groundwork, which then feeds into the point at which we can pick it up and actually say, this is the big picture. And there's an accretion, isn't there? I mean, you pick at something and you think, oh, there was this that they were doing and it was connected to that. And I think that's dark money influencing that, but I'm not sure. And it takes time and expansive coverage to reach that critical point at which it cuts through in the news, and you can actually publish it in a way for a wider audience.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's very, very time-consuming, kind of painstaking work, and you can often spend a long time on something and not really find good enough stories in there. So I suppose it's maybe difficult for bigger outlets to feel like that's something that they want to kind of invest lots of time and money into. And it's, yeah, I guess it is easy to dismiss as kind of fringe and irrelevant. But of course, as we've seen with lots of kind of political upheavals in the last few years, something is fringe until it's suddenly not, and it's very mainstream, and it's completely captured the kind of the narrative. So yeah, I think we've always kind of seen our role as sort of supporting other bigger outlets with investigations, and we'll often kind of collaborate on stories after doing some of the kind of legwork ourselves to establish that there is something there worth kind of reporting on.
Yeah, just to add that, from our perspective, open democracy, like there is that real sense in which you are able to build on each other's work as well. I think it's so, and it is nothing better. We get cited a lot in other newspapers, and our stories can actually, and probably, can end up having a life way after we publish them as well, because we can publish stories that maybe, it might be harder for various reasons for a mainstream newspaper to publish, and they can become very relevant down the line. Someone emerges as a donor who we've written about in the past. Next thing you know, actually, what happened last weekend, there was a big scandal with a political politician in Britain, and we'd written about a Russian who it turned out had actually been secretly donating to this politician, and we'd done quite a few stories on that person. So they started getting circulation and helped to build the corpus of knowledge, and those stories wouldn't have been out there otherwise. There's an accretion. I think there's a need for a media ecosystem that allows different players like us to exist, because otherwise, it's the kind of, like, no journalist is an island. You're often working and inspired by the work of others. I'm conscious of time. We've had, actually, it's very surprisingly, that sending you my DMs, it turns out that it kind of works, actually, I think, a little bit. So thank you very much for helping us with that. And my bizarre surname doesn't seem to have stopped it completely. But just to pick up one or two, and I might just read a couple of them out, and we can jump in as we want. Anna is asking, how have playbook tactics evolved on social media? Are we seeing an effective use of social media influencers to spread narratives, or are more traditional media still the main channel? I think which is a really, really interesting. I do think social media has changed the dial. As I opened this conversation talking about this Car 26 group that I saw appear in the Daily Telegraph, they've had huge amounts of media coverage since then through social media, and they're connected to. Social media now produces mainstream media headlines, because I'm sure wherever you're from, you're seeing more and more newspaper stories that are about something someone said on Twitter. So there's a two-way street happening too, and I think using social media influencers has become a really big way of pushing these messages at the same time. I think it's both diminished the power of traditional media, but also traditional media's reliance on social media for stories, because it looks as if, it's a great way of astroturfing, and Felicity used that phrase, and it's a phrase that we all use a lot in our work, these astroturf groups that the counterpoise is a grassroots group with deep roots. These are groups that just appear out of nowhere, and social media allows you to look like you have traction, looks like you've got connections and influence in a way that you mightn't necessarily. So I think that to me is something we're definitely seeing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely seems to be emerging as a kind of battleground for this. We did a story fairly recently on a kind of astroturf group that we'd spotted were kind of paying for lots of very misleading ads on Facebook, kind of claiming that climate change is a hoax and all this kind of stuff, and we managed to kind of trace it back to this obscure think tank based in Cardiff, and it was all quite embarrassing because there were lots of Conservative MPs on the board of this think tank, and this person was kind of running this very kind of dubious site called EcoCentral, which sounded very kind of green, but it was kind of the opposite. So yeah, you're seeing a lot of this, I think.
Yeah, if I turn myself off, sorry. They do give you clues. The sort of Brexit Central was a big thing, and Eco Central. They tend to kind of get a bit lazy about the names, which helps. But yeah, it definitely has migrated to social media, and it is quite hard to track who all the groups are. But there is a great proliferation of them. But the thing that does help is that they're very often, if you start tracking them, they track back to the sort of the mainstream media think tank world. So there's actually a remarkably small number of people doing all this. So they're really giving value for money to their paymasters.
I'm conscious of time, so I will draw this to a close. But I want to say, there's questions gone unanswered, which I think is great. And thank you for all of your, for you all coming here today. It's really appreciated. And I want to say a big thank you to my panelists, Felicity Lawrence, Rich Collett-White, and I've been Peter Kagan. Thank you very much.